Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Frank.
I'm excited to talk to you again about these issues, and also thank you because I know these aren't always easy to talk about. So I appreciate your willingness to engage them with such candor. For starters, a lot of the issues you bring up, a lot of the concerns you have are encapsulated in something that happened recently at Evergreen State. And I know from the reception last night, not everybody in the audience has followed that story. Could you talk to us about what happened at Evergreen State?
Sure, I'm actually curious. Raise your hand if you know the story. Raise your hand if you're familiar with it. Okay, so only about 10%. So there have been all these cases. They seem like these bizarre anecdotes. This is one that I think you should read about. I'll tell you briefly about it because it has everything. It's like the most incredible story. So Evergreen State College, very progressive school out near Seattle. A very progressive professor there, Brett Weinstein, wrote an email objecting to a new diversity policy. So for years, Evergreen has had a day of absence where the black students especially and other people of color go off campus and have various programming. And so Weinstein says, that's a great idea. That's powerful. That's a way to show the importance of the community. So he's been totally supportive of that. But this year, the head of diversity proposed a new policy, which is the people of color stay on campus and the white students and professors are supposed to leave. They're supposed to not teach their classes, not go to their classes. And Weinstein is a true liberal, thinks that this is very different to tell people what they can and can't do. And so he writes a letter objecting to it. Now, there have been a variety of new policies that he's been objecting to for a long time, and he can't get the administration to engage in debate. So he's already frustrated that these changes are being imposed on the faculty, changes in hiring, all sorts of changes, no discussion, no debate. So he writes a public letter, and it's very respectful, very progressive, and he says, consider this my objection to the policy. He says
that he won't be leaving campus.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. So he teaches his classes, and now the students don't disrupt it on that day, but for some reason later, days later, weeks later, 50 of them come to his class, disrupt it, shout it down. He goes out in the hallway. He's talking with them. And it's a very familiar scene. I showed it to Nicholas Christakis from Yale, said, oh my God, it's the same dynamic. And then when he refused to apologize, because they're calling him racist, they're demanding that he apologize, and when he won't do it.
Well, there's also, if I can interrupt you 1 second, I was watching the video quite recently. There's a moment where some are throwing questions at him, some are just hurling slurs at him. And at one point, not the only point, he says, would you like to hear the answer or not? And more than one student screams, no.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Because it is not a discussion or dialogue. It is a kind of a ritual act, I think, actually. So anyway, he refuses to apologize. They then march off. They corner the president. And the video, I just watched it this morning, the video of the students screaming at the president, saying, shut the F up, to his face. Right. And the president is just so meek and, thank you, sir, may I have another? It's horrifying.
I want to come back to that, but can we pull out for a second? This is not, I think it's important to say, this is not all students, nor would you assert that, right?
Oh, no, never.
I mean, we don't really know, or do we, how big a group of students at universities we're talking about today.
Yeah, so I'm a social psychologist, and I study morality and how concerned we are about our public display. My sense, I'm a professor at NYU, my sense is that it's a minority of students on every campus. I don't think there's one where it's a majority who think this way. But it's basically the emperor's new clothes, because there's a minority that is so morally empowered that to stand up to them is to be called a racist. And it's not all black students, it's their allies too. So it's not, obviously there's a racial aspect here, but it's more of a moral political subgroup, which grows out of the humanities especially, that is, just in the last 2 or 3 years, so vocal that everyone else is just quiet. So it's a minority always, but they often dominate the campus culture.
When you wrote about this recently, and I think you would have said this about what happened at Middlebury and other places too, you said that what you're witnessing has more than a passing resemblance to witch hunts. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. So, witch hunts are not actual efforts to find real witches, but there's a dynamic that happens where everyone's afraid of it. And the more you accuse, if you're afraid of being called a witch, one of the best ways to show you're not a witch is to accuse other people of being a witch. And there's a great article on victimhood culture written 2 or 3 years ago on the origin of microaggressions, where they say, in the new moral order, there's only 2 ways to achieve status. One, show how you've been victimized, you've been harmed and victimized. Or 2, attack other people for victimizing people. And so this is the atmosphere of a witch hunt, where the students are focusing on their victimization, or they are accusing whoever they can, and the accusations have no bearing in reality. They don't even bother reading what Weinstein has written. They didn't bother reading, so it's divorced from reality, and there's a circling and a calling for the witch to be burned, which in this case means fired. It's always, he has to be fired. Hey, hey, ho, 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 Brett Weinstein racist teacher has to go.
I want to talk about how the university president ultimately responded, but to set that up, I want to read something else you wrote, a reflection of what happened at Evergreen and at other places. If a mob comes for you, there is a good chance that the president of your university will side with the mob and validate its narrative, as the presidents at Yale and Evergreen have done, although the presidents at Middlebury and Claremont McKenna did not.
That's right.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So, campuses are fascinating social institutions with multiple competing ideologies and ways of looking at the world. And the president and the faculty have a role in shaping the students' construction of what is this place? What are we doing here? And what we've seen in many cases, so Peter Salovey at Yale was one of the clearest, the students gave him an ultimatum. They said, here are demands, you have 6 days or 7 days to meet our demands. Now, a couple of presidents, actually Krisloff at Oberlin, there are a few presidents who said, no, you can't give me an ultimatum. I'm always happy to talk with you. Let's talk, but you cannot give me an ultimatum. But most presidents don't seem to, I don't want to cast aspersions, I don't know why. They say, yes, I will meet, okay, yes, I've got 6 days, okay, and then they do what they can. And Peter Salovey came out by saying, we have failed you. He validated their narrative. Whereas what a good leader would do is say, you have many valid concerns. I hear you on this, that, and that. On the other hand, what Erika Christakis wrote has to be protected. We should be able to talk to each other. And Salovey never stood up for the Christakises. He let them hang. And that's what we see over and over is the presidents have to decide. Are they so afraid of the protesters that they will just say, please, I'll do what you want, I'll do what you want, or are they going to try to be a leader? And most are not leaders.
Are those presidents who in your estimation cave, are they enemies of free speech, and are they doing things that are antithetical to liberal arts?
Oh my goodness, yes. Free speech is a kind of an unnatural thing, okay? I mean, if you look at the broad history of humanity, we've lived in these small tribal groups governed by these intense rituals that govern what we can eat, what we can wear, what we can, we're tribal religious creatures. That's the gist of my book, The Righteous Mind. And somehow we carved out this space over a couple hundred years with these liberal institutions that allow people who don't share the same religion and ideology to coexist, and they're better off for it, because if you have people, Larry Summers was saying this a few minutes ago, it's when you have people say, I believe this, well, no, I think you're wrong. That's what creates the possibility of a university where we can make progress towards truth. And when the president of the university doesn't stand up for that, when he says, okay, you are the group that gets to decide, I validate your narrative, I'm not going to speak up for anybody else, you get to decide who comes to campus, you get to decide what's over the line. You can't have a university in those circumstances. It's just, you just have a monastery, an ideological training ground with perfect orthodoxy.
You use the phrase over the line.
Yes.
When it comes to speakers invited to campus, is there an over the line? Would you draw any lines? And if we're drawing lines, how do we figure out who's merely a provocative speaker and who is so irresponsible, so insulting, so out of nowhere that it is an offense to the whole community? How do we make those determinations?
Yeah. Well, I think there are two bright lines. One is the one that's in the law, which is that free speech does not allow you to intimidate or threaten violence or incite violence. And I think we all have to look very carefully at the role of intimidation on campus today. A lot of people are saying things because they feel they have to, or they won't say things because they feel they don't. So there's a lot of intimidation. Speakers who use intimidation, that's over the line, that's often illegal. Secondly, is the speech in any way an honor? Is it an endowed lectureship? Is it an honorary degree, as Larry Summers was saying? That's entirely different. If students want to protest and say, no, we're not going to give an honorary degree to that guy, that's totally legitimate. But if a campus group invites Charles Murray or Heather McDonald, or often it's actually somebody even on the left, Christine Lagarde, if they invite an actual Nazi, if they invite someone from Ku Klux Klan who's not violent, should the university disinvite them? And what I'd ask you, and I've thought about this a lot, and I think back when I was at Yale, I entered in 1981, and David Duke was the thing back then. And I thought, if David Duke had been invited to campus, would I have wanted to see him? Hell yes. I mean, this is a major aspect of American life. I read Mein Kampf. It was fascinating. I'm Jewish. I'm interested in these things. And if David Duke was invited to campus and I wanted to see him, how would I feel about some other students blocking the door, preventing me from going in, or if I got in, shouting him down? How dare they? How dare they decide what I get to see? If they don't like it, don't go.
So those students who would be so offended by him being there and disagree, what would be a more appropriate way, or is there an appropriate way for them to register their upset without blocking your right to hear him speak?
So I looked at the NYU protest policy. It's very detailed. It's very reasonable. I mean, I've looked at Chicago's. It's much shorter, but gives the basic principles, and it makes it clear we support your right to protest. You can be in the room. You can hold up signs. It even says brief outbursts are okay. But the line is, if your protest prevents the speaker from speaking or the listeners from listening, then you're infringing others' rights. The line's actually very clear.
So get up, stand with your back to the speaker, that would be fine.
Yep, walk out, even walk out with a nasty or angry chant. Fine, because the event, if it stops for a couple of minutes, that's fine.
Is there something larger going on here when we talk about these protests of speakers, when we add to that trigger warnings, which I know have been discussed, all that sort of thing? Are students, many students today, getting the message that they need not be exposed to ideas and thoughts that upset them?
Absolutely. So one of the most dangerous trends, so I go back and forth between thinking that universities are going to hell, we only have a few more years, and thinking this is the most fascinating time to be a social scientist in the 20th century, except maybe for the 30s, 21st, whatever, in the last couple hundred years, except for maybe for the 1930s. And there's so many things going on, but one of the most dangerous is this new culture of safetyism. The most important psychological truth I think we all need to know for raising kids or educating students is antifragility. Nassim Taleb's book, Antifragile. It says that human beings, like many systems in the world, only become strong by being repeatedly exposed to shocks, challenges, unpleasant events. We overcome them, we're stronger. Like when I was at Yale, occasionally you'd see a swastika written on a bathroom stall. And I didn't like it, but I saw that many times. And now someone I can't say because we're on TV, but somebody
Did you feel it was the university's responsibility to make sure that? That's
the point, no. Whereas today, students have learned to construct it, that if they see something like that, they are unsafe, and it is the university's responsibility. So you have to choose. Do you want your school to embrace safetyism, and do you commit to creating a zero unpleasantness environment? No graffiti, no off-campus person says something unpleasant. You will never get there. So if you try to go that way, I guarantee you will always have gigantic protests and students feeling they're unsafe. Or you can embrace anti-fragility and do more like the Chicago policy. It says, look, the university provides a platform. People can test. If it's just words, you deal with it.
You've talked about some of the things that you think university presidents should do, but I doubt we've gotten to all of it. Yeah. You are university president for a year at NYU or elsewhere. What do you do there that pushes back against these things that concern you? What would you recommend to people in this audience?
So the first thing is I'd want to know what's going on. So I would go to heterodoxacademy.org, which is an organization that me and some other professors created. We now have 800 members, 800 professors who have dared to sign on to a statement that we think there should be viewpoint diversity at universities. That's it. That's what we stand for. Go to our resources page or solutions page, and we have all kinds of things that will help you figure out what's going on and what you can do. So the first thing is you got to actually have good data. We're social scientists. What's the problem? So we have a survey that you can give out to find out. It's called the Fearless Speech Index. Who is afraid of speaking up, on what issues, and why? Maybe it's not a problem on your campus. Or maybe the issue on your campus is gender, not race, or sexual orientation. Find out what are the issues where people are afraid to speak up, or people are really upset and feeling hurt and marginalized. So you got to get good data first. Second, you have to be a moral leader, which means you have to stand up for principles. And you have to decide, is your university going to be a more traditional university where scholars in a community engage in the search for truth? That's the way Chicago and a few other schools are going. Or do you want to do what Christina Paxton said is Brown is committed, has a bedrock commitment to social justice, and we will reorient things so that everything we do is about social justice. And that's what Weinstein was objecting to at Evergreen, is that the new administration was turning it into a university where even every hire has to have an equity justification. You can't hire someone because he's a good chemist. So those are the two directions. So as president, you decide. If you're going the social justice route, you've got a lot of help, you've got a lot of instructions, and things are going to be much, much more tense on your campus in future years. If you want to go the Truth University route, then we've got a lot of resources at Heterox Academy. Rethink how you orient students. When they come to campus, don't start them off with microaggression training. If you're going to have diversity, you've got to cultivate generosity of spirit. Diversity is potentially divisive. And if you teach students, you know what? Your eyes are fine, but your neighbor's eyes, they're so full of specks. And we have a course that will teach you to find ever smaller specks in your neighbor's eyes. That's microaggression training. If you do that, you can expect constant anger and students feeling hurt by previously inoffensive or unintentional words.
We're going to have some questions from the audience lobbed at you in a second, but I wanted to ask you one more. The last time you and I sat down and talked about this stuff, it was on a Charlie Rose segment. We were being questioned by another white man, and a lot of the blowback I got, and I assume maybe you got this too, it's part of the question, was the three of you have no credibility talking about this because you're all white men. Respond to that.
Sure. So you always try to look at what the person is right about, and if they're saying that there were certain perspectives that were not there at the table, you would say, yeah, you're absolutely right. And we welcome different voices. We surely have missed some things. We ourselves have not been marginalized in those ways. I mean, you're gay, you have some experience, but it's not a racial experience. So say absolutely. But did the person say no credibility? They said
Pretty
no
much,
credibility.
yeah.
So this is what happens. Young people are taught, literally taught, to evaluate an argument, not by what is said, but first and foremost by the race and sex and privilege status of the speaker. Now, if you want diversity on your school, should you teach people to try to get along, trust each other, listen to each other, or should you teach people the teachings of Herbert Marcuse, which are that the privileged people already take up too much space, we need to shut them up. That is true tolerance. And the victims, they're the ones who should speak. And so young people today do not learn. I've been talking for so long, I've been writing for so long, there's almost no arguments made back. It's always a slur. It's always, yeah, you're a white guy defending your privilege. Well, okay, maybe, but do you have anything to say in response to my argument? So sure, there's some legitimacy there,
right.
But to use that to shut down, to dismiss us, to say whatever we said is worthless because of your race and gender, that should be so outrageous to all of you. That should be one of the worst things a person could say.
Adam, do we have some more questions from the audience?
I imagine we do. This is so fascinating. Hand right here. And please, when we get a microphone to you, if you could introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Richie Hunter, and I'm the Vice President for Strategic Communications and External Relations with Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And I actually have 100 questions, but I'll focus on one.
Okay.
As you were speaking about safetyism and that we should not create this mirage that there's an unsafety aspect to a campus.
Based on words, yes.
Based on words. How do you balance that with the actual unsafe environment that, and I'm going to focus in on people of color, and I could even go down to males of color, and you see this in the news if you just, open the newspaper in the last month. Or we can get Sean back out here, and I'm sure he can give us 1,000 examples. How do you balance that point of view with the facts of unsafe environments where you would feel that it's tolerant?
Sure, that's a great question. There are two bright lines that I think we can draw. One is that being physically attacked is a very serious matter. Sexual assault on campus is a very serious matter. Hearing words, even words that you find insulting, is of a qualitatively different order. And we can talk about what we want to do about speech that is taken as racist, but we have a very bright line at physical violence or physical threat. And the language of safety is totally appropriate on one side of that line. And the language of safety, while it seems like there's a gray area where maybe it's appropriate, you get a slippery slope where before you know it, ideas that threaten my firm beliefs are taken as dangerous. Can you imagine a university that promised that you will not encounter threats to the beliefs that you had when you came in? That's the first bright line. Second bright line is people's intent. And this is the problem with microaggression training. Students are learning today that it doesn't matter what the intent was. If the intent was a question motivated by curiosity or an attempt to be helpful that was clumsy, it doesn't matter. It's aggression. And when we're telling our students, there's always stupid things said, let's treat them in the worst possible way. Let's ignore intent and interpret it as an act of aggression. Now, go have fun for 4 years. You're going to have such conflict between groups. So I think there are bright lines. The specific concerns that you have, I totally share. Those are important to talk about. But don't let it bleed over into, he said something which makes me feel unsafe.
Another question? In the back, this side.
Josh Thomasis. I'm the Dean of Innovation Policy and Research at Bank Street College of Education here in New York. I appreciate sorry.
Oh, back there. Okay,
There
thank
go.
you.
I appreciate the accurate aspiration towards a campus that would enable dialogue and dialogue across difference, and rather than having an edict of a very narrow band. It does strike me that what's missing from the conversation so far has been an analysis of power. And language does have power. And the presumption that however insulting something might be, it's simply an insult and it doesn't carry power, I think is missing and is an inaccurate picture of what microaggression training is about, but also what does it mean to grapple with a diversity of perspectives to enable folks from both the left and the right to come and debate on campus, and that's necessary, but also figure out how to honestly grapple with the experiences of power in language.
Sure.
And that silence, that the other option being the silencing of those who historically have been silenced, which
So,
is true
yeah.
in the sort of Nazi story from
Sure.
from 1981 as well.
Okay, so you're right that power has been absent from our discussion today, but power is the dominant theme in discussions of this on campus. In fact, young people today are taught explicitly to think about everything in terms of power. Now, power is often important, but look, I'm a psychologist, and I had to work long and hard with my students to say, okay, let's read Freud. Freud said everything's sex. You know what? Sex is important, but it's not everything. All right, let's talk about economics. Okay, self-interest and money is important, but it's not everything. Power is important, but it's not everything. Young people today are being taught that power is everything, and they look at everything through that one lens. I think they're getting a bad education, and it harms them. It's going to make it much more difficult for them to deal with future situations after they leave college. In terms of language is powerful, yes, but I think it's not as powerful as people on the left think. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that if the Eskimos have more words for snow, they can detect more words for snow, that turns out to be almost entirely false. I don't think language is as powerful as people on the left think. Orwell wrote about Newspeak. The left has a tendency to focus on words. And there's a great quote I just read from Todd Gitlin. It was something like, while the Republic is from the early 90s, while the Republicans are taking over the White House and doing this and that, the Democrats have invaded the English department. There's such a focus on language, and it matters, but not nearly as much as you think. So I think it's overemphasized.
Yeah. One more question from the audience. We're also on Facebook Live, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions from the audience. Please identify yourself.
I'm Fanny Smiller, president of Hamline University. I, too, am a social psychologist and know Peter Salovey very well. We were students together at Yale. The question that I have for you is, when we say that words aren't as powerful as they might seem, as a social psychologist, would you not agree with the research that shows the impact of words on especially kids of color ability to succeed academically? So to say that words aren't that powerful, I think is not acknowledging the history that exists in this country in terms of the impact it's had on various people, not just people of color, but people who are gay and lesbian. I mean, it has a tremendous impact on that. So just wondering about that. But the other question I want to put to you is that when we think about, if we focus only on the behavior in which people engage, I'm an attitude researcher, you focus only on the behavior in which people engage, are we then not paying attention to what's underlying that behavior and attempting to understand that rather than focusing solely on the behavior? So how do we connect the attitudes and the behavior in such a way that we then get a better understanding of why the behavior occurred in the first place. So what has been the underlying factors?
Right, okay, thank you. So let me clarify. I should not have said words or language matters less than we think, because obviously if I say something to you and I am conveying an insult or a put down, that's incredibly powerful. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but boy, names and other verbal slights can last forever. So I didn't mean to say that what we say doesn't matter. What I meant was, if you have the focus on changing a term, or changing the idea, this Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that if we change the words that people think with, this will have a big effect. That's what I meant to criticize. Those effects are very small and often zero. If we're all concerned about prejudice, we're all concerned about stereotypes. And as far as I understand it, the research on stereotypes and prejudice says that most of the effects we're talking about, implicit bias, are very, very small. There's even a question if they actually matter at all for behavior. But when people perceive differences in the environment, that is huge. In other words, the attention, if we want to get rid of stereotypes and prejudice, we need to actually create equality, not try to just manipulate words so that people don't see things. And so I think much more focus on actually creating environments in which we reduce the visible discrepancies between groups and give them a common in-group identity. That will foster very positive interactions. This is contact theory. If people are interacting on a college campus across racial lines, across other lines, with a sense of common identity and some trust and roughly equal status, it's generally going to make things much better. So I think presidents, deans need to be thinking about the environment they're creating, because if you get things right, interracial contact is really, really good. I would focus on that rather than define this word you can't say, that word you can't say. Those effects, I think, are much smaller.
Question from Facebook Live from Jim in California. Are there any campuses that exhibit exemplary methods of dealing with this issue that serve as a model?
Well, I think we don't know yet, because it only really went national in November of 2015. That's when Peter Salovey, so the fall of 2015 was an amazing semester, a lot changed. But if you go to the demands.org, those are all from just November of 2015. What we're doing at Heterodox Academy is we're trying to study, so we have a guide to colleges. We're trying to collect all the information we can find about what kind of climate a student would find if he or she goes to that school. And what we're discovering is you really have to separate what's the student climate, like if you're a student, what are the other students going to be like about speech and viewpoint diversity? What are the administrators going to be like, and what are the faculty going to be like? And the three are not necessarily correlated at all. So I don't know yet. There's no exemplary campus. The University of Chicago's general policy, I think, is exemplary for the administrators. I don't know yet whether the students are really going along with it. I can't tell, or the faculty. But I think the administration, the more you say, we provide a platform on which divergent views can contest, don't try to make us commit to taking one side. That is, I think, necessary, because if you don't take that view, you'll have endless protests of students demanding that you endorse this petition, that view. So I think the administration has a crucial role, and Chicago, I think, has done it best.
And last question, there were a couple of questions on Facebook as well. Have you seen any differences, red state, blue state, any studies that have been done?
Yeah. Yes, so at Heterodox Academy, we have some analyses of the politics of the professoriate. And in general, the finding is that the professors have leaned to the left throughout the 20th century, but it was only 2 or 3 to 1 until the early 90s. Between the early 90s and 2010, it shifted to 5 to 1. That's including the agriculture school and everything. If you look at the core social sciences and humanities, it's 20 or 30 to 1, or 50 to 1 sometimes. It's, for some reason, much, much higher in New England. So in New England, the left-right ratio is extraordinarily left-tilted, and then also some on the West Coast. So we know that engineering schools have much less of this, of these conflicts and problems. The sort of very charged political climate with fear of speaking up is especially common, probably less common in the Mountain West and the South is what we're finding.
That's great. Fascinating discussion. I'll give it back to Frank for last words, but we're going to take a break. We'll see you back at 11:15. It's been a fascinating morning. I hope you've enjoyed it. Over to you, Frank.
Yeah, I just want to thank you very much for your time, and thank you all. As you can see, there was great interest. We went over time, I think deservedly so, and thank you for sharing your time with us.
Okay. Thank you, Frank. Thank you all.